Emma's a disability climate justice activist. She's the Climate and Disability Programme Associate for the Bristol Climate and Nature Partnership and is an advisor on the Sensing Climate Research Group. She's also a Personal to Planetary Fellow, and she's one of the authors of the City of Bristol Just Transition Declaration. So we're very lucky to have her here with us. I'm going to stop my screen sharing so that Emma can start hers, and so that we can see all of you briefly. That's lovely to see all of your faces. So I'm going to pass over to Emma. And as I said, we will have time for questions at the end. So please hold any and note them down if that will be useful for you. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks so much. Lovely to meet you all. So many different projects from across the country. Can you see my slides now? Yeah, so this is just a photo of me and some other disabled people holding a blue banner in front of Bristol City Hall saying, "Make the future green and accessible." So it's not a huge amount of time I've got today, and I'm also aware that quite often people don't seem to be aware of how disability is a climate change issue. So I wanted to start with a little bit, just like running through why disability is a climate change issue and why you should be thinking about disabled people in your work. So sorry if you know this already. I'm aware that some of you might be disabled people yourselves, but I find it's kind of useful to run through. So yes, though we're not often talked about during this kind of sector, we're actually one of the most vulnerable communities in the face of climate change. So a statistic that I often use is that we're up to 4 times more likely to be killed or harmed in natural disasters, and more likely to be left behind in evacuation. I think sometimes people think about that as thinking there's something kind of inherently kind of vulnerable in disabled people, but actually the problem really here is the fact that society is inaccessible and there's a lack of disaster planning. So for example, if you're kind of in a kind of extreme weather situation, you've got to escape from flooding or whatever coming in, and if you're a wheelchair user and the pavements outside your house are blocked by cars or recycling boxes or just not suitable for wheeling on, then of course you're going to be more likely to be caught by those kind of natural disasters just because the infrastructure around you is not accessible and not fit for your needs. So there's this really importance of kind of thinking about how we plan our societies and everything we do in terms of making sure that as climate change worsens, all these impacts are not going to hit harder on disabled people who are already kind of locked out of society for a whole bunch of different reasons. I think there's also a problem around kind of how society in general is doing kind of adaptation and resilience planning. So, for example, a lot of the plans for how we are going to cope with the climate change getting worse kind of assume a non-disabled body. So, for example, here in Bristol, a lot of the resilience planning around kind of heat waves and things is thinking about things like having green spaces within 10 minutes walk around the city. What does that mean if you can't walk? But even if you can walk and get to a park, a lot of those spaces are not accessible for disabled people in different ways. For example, in Bristol, we have a lot of gates where you can't actually get through if you're a wheelchair user, just because people are so worried about this idea of people taking motorbikes through. So all sorts of different problems of how we're thinking about how going about this work, but not thinking about the needs of everyone. And then they're also kind of like, because disabled people are locked out of society in different ways, that means that then they're more susceptible to climate change issues just because of that kind of multiple forms of disadvantage adding up. So, for example, lots of disabled people are forced to live in areas where it's more likely to flood because of where the social housing is, or just in terms of being able to afford property there. But then if you're kind of more at risk to kind of escaping from floods and things, what does that mean? And a similar kind of issue with heat waves. So a lot of disabled people I'm talking to are already kind of really struggling with heat waves. We're getting collapsing in top floor flats, or not able to get into cold spaces because they're not accessible. We often are into places like churches and things which have big steps. So yeah, it's just not being thought through on multiple different levels. I mean, some disabled people with some conditions can be more susceptible to heat. So, for example, people with multiple sclerosis can be more susceptible to heat. And, for example, people with some kinds of lung conditions might be more susceptible to air pollution than others. But on the whole, it's a kind of issue that's just not being thought about by society. So I don't want you to think, disabled people are more vulnerable just because of something inherent in us. It's because our needs are not being thought about within this issue. And then kind of even within that issue, there's various things like not having enough resources, limits the ability of disabled people to prepare. A lot of communication about climate change is just not accessible. So for example, here in Bristol, when there was a bridge closure in terms of traffic calming, they didn't issue kind of those changes in through a BSL video. For a lot of deaf people were caught going across that bridge because there was no way for them to find out about it. It was only in the last few years that they actually created some signs so that BSL users can actually talk about climate change in terms of not having the language to actually be able to engage with the conversation. And this is all kind of extra concerning because what happened through COVID, which in some ways could be thought about as an environmental disaster, was that disabled people were 6 out of 10 people who died. So we're really being thought about as the kind of acceptable sacrifice when things get bad, which is just really not acceptable or necessary in any way. Also, there's a huge problem in terms of because disabled people are so locked out of the climate conversation, you're getting a huge problem with eco-ableism, which is basically new barriers being created by climate action that doesn't think about our needs. So, for example, talk a lot about the plastic straw bans. So people tend to talk about the straw ban as if it's a big success, but really, when you think about things like ocean plastic waste, that's mostly coming from industry, fishing nets, and that kind of thing. Stopping plastic straws only changed that by like a tiny amount. But plastic straws were an assistive device used by disabled people before we started like sticking them into our Fanta and that kind of thing. So really, those kinds of changes can like not actually really fix the problem, but create a whole new barrier for a group of people who are already facing a huge amount of barriers in society. And I think this is an extra problem with things like climate change issues because a lot of the changes that are being created now to adapt and kind of mitigate the problems are not properly understood. So there's not like a standard way to make them accessible. So currently I'm looking a lot at things like energy and how things like heat pumps and that kind of thing can work with various different communities. So for example, heat pumps, they're meant to be run at an ambient temperature. But if you have to have your house at a constant kind of higher temperature for your condition, what does that mean? I've had lots of disabled people saying that means their costs are going through the roof. And where a lot of you probably might be working with like smaller scale projects, but I think it's important to think about it on that level as well. Like I had people say to me like, oh, I put a planter onto a street and then people got really upset and I don't know why, it's just a planter. But if you put that planter in front of a drop curb, it might just be a small planter, but a drop curb is basically where a wheelchair user will get off of the pavement down to the road so that they then cross the pavement, go to other places. So effectively, a little planter could trap someone in his house, stop them from being able to go to work, stop them being able to go to hospital. So it's really important that in all of our projects, we're thinking about how kind of the access needs of everyone in the community are being thought about. All of this has left some disabled people feeling like the kind of environmental movement is ableist and it's not for them, which is both, it's a massive shame, both because I feel like the movement really should welcome in disabled people, but I think also there's like a huge opportunity here for the disability movement as well, in terms of if we're making all these huge changes to our society, if we're digging up roads, putting heat networks, if we're like changing all of our infrastructure and transport and that kind of thing, it wouldn't really cost that much more to make all those things accessible at the same time and fix a lot of the accessibility problems we've had in our society for a long time. So really, I think there's like a huge synthesis, a huge joining up to be made between the disability environmental movements to work towards some common goals. And I think really we should be allies in all this. But to do that, we have to make sure disabled people are given a seat at the table every step of the process, which is why it's really great to talk to all of you, so that hopefully you can be thinking about the community in your work. Before I go on to kind of how to work with disabled people, I want to talk a little bit about just in terms of what the community is like. Because I think often people think, oh, disabled people, we're this little minority that doesn't, it's a kind of nice thing to do to include us, but we're not really, that important in any way. But so a term I often use is the not yet disabled to talk about non-disabled people, because actually most people are disabled either temporarily or permanently during their lifetime. So often that's kind of as people kind of age, the older people kind of get mobility impairments or kind of sensory impairments. But it can happen to anybody at any time of their life. And in fact, it's the only minority group that anybody can enter at any time of their life. So the national statistic is we're 24% of the population. That's the largest minority group. That's including everything from kind of mental health issues to mobility issues to sensory issues to learning difficulties. And all those barriers I've been talking about, like on the previous slides, are affecting not only the disabled people, but everyone around them. So their carers, their family, small issues can kind of spread out huge. And unfortunately, as climate change gets worse, we're going to see lots more disabled people being created by these problems. So, for example, I read the other day that 3% of the population in the UK apparently has long COVID. So long COVID is considered a disability now. And as we kind of get more pandemics and more disasters, we're going to get more and more people becoming disabled. So yeah, and the changes we make now are going to be with us basically for the rest of our lives. And if all of us are going to become disabled, if we're not disabled already within our lifetime, it's surely within all of our interest to think about making the changes that we make now accessible so that, whatever happens to us in the future will be included. I mean, I talked a lot about disabled people as being a vulnerable community, but I also want to kind of really highlight us as an important voice for change as well. So for the ableism through just kind of not thinking about us or through not thinking that we're important means that the environmental movement is losing out on a huge many kind of like important voices and activists. So I often talk about how to be disabled is to live in a society that isn't made for your needs. And then you kind of get really good at adapting to kind of find ways around that. And I think really as climate change worsens, we're going to see like a kind of world that's less and less fit for our needs, like where we're less and less safe, and we're going to have to adapt to work out how we live within that kind of new environment. And so I think disabled people have a lot of that skills and expertise to think about how we adapt to kind of this increasingly unfriendly world. And disabled people are passionate about this. So some research done by the Research Institute of Disabled Consumers found that 97% of disabled people are very concerned and 95% are already making changes. And certainly the kind of work I've done in Bristol has found sort of similar numbers. We're also kind of we can bring new angles, perspective, wisdoms. I think we're really can have a lot of wisdom about like how you don't overextend kind of limits and kind of like understanding of the kind of anti-capitalist values that I think we really need to tackle climate change, and the importance of just kind of care and valuing all life. And of course, the kind of greatest example here is Greta Thunberg, so who is autistic, and that kind of she talks about her autism as being a superpower in terms of looking at things in a different way. Like there is a bit of a problem about talking about disability as a superpower, but because Greta Thunberg said that of her own self, I think that's kind of a fine way of looking at it. So sorry, gabbling a little bit because I'm trying to get through this in 20 minutes, but since I've covered that, I was going to talk a little bit about how you might want to go about working with disabled people on your work. And I think when Transition Together first approached me about this, I was a little bit nervous about this because I think there's so little understanding of disability in the society. I was just slightly worried that like a little bit of knowledge could kind of do more harm than good. But I think if you approach this in the kind of way I'm suggesting, that like it's an opportunity to go away and sort of start growing instead of creating problems. But I think the important thing here is like to not make assumptions, not think you kind of know what the kind of access needs of people are around you. So for example, I have one arm. I was born like this. People are forever making assumptions about what I can do. Like I've been on holidays where I've helped kind of like cut down trees and kind of clear scrub and like kind of environmental management stuff. And like after a couple of days, then normally somebody would come up to me and like try and wrestle a tree off me and say, you can't do that, you're a disabled person. Like, well, I've just been doing it for the last 2 days. So like when's not being able to do it supposed to kick in? So I think like just be, yeah, when you're kind of thinking about working with disabled people around you, kind of don't think that you know how they can do things just because they, for example, if you had that condition, you would act in or think in a certain way. So it's really important to acknowledge that disabled people are the experts on disability. The kind of slogan of the movement is nothing about us without us. Um, and it's also important to kind of be aware of how much difference there is within the community. So different impairments have different access needs, different experiences. I think probably as well as being the largest minority group, we're probably the most like diverse kind of within our community. And it's very hard for like one person to understand the whole breadth of that. Um, so I think the only way to really go about doing this work is making sure you're kind of not just got kind of one representative disabled person. Like you don't want to go to your mum or whatever and say, oh, they're disabled, they can speak for everyone. Actually, there's so much diversity of kind of lived experience here that's about finding ways to kind of get that whole intersection of views. So I really recommend working with disabled people's organisations. So this is a bit of a different thing from the disability charity, because it's basically about a DPO is a charity that's like led by disabled people. So kind of those that philosophy and knowledge is for. Like obviously that takes money normally. So I'm aware that a lot of you might not have a lot of resources. So you might want to find other ways of doing, like, for example, building like an experience panel. So like that is when you kind of bring together like a little group of disabled people who represent kind of a range of different impairments. So you're getting some of that cross section. Or you might want to just do a lot of wide consultation, like going to talking to as many disabled people as you can. The kind of how you want to do about it is kind of a bit of a complicated one. So I'm with the Sensing Climate Research Project down in Exeter. We're developing a guide to kind of help people to go about doing this work, which I'll hopefully once that's published, I'll share it with Rona, and then hopefully you can all have access to that. Which will have some more detailed advice, but I'll just explain a little bit here. So that's called Grip Up Climate Conversations Guide, just to make you aware, like grip is a kind of word that's been reclaimed by the movement in a similar way that queer has been reclaimed by the LGBT plus movement. But yeah, I guess the kind of top line things are like, first of all, kind of acknowledging the valuable kind of resource of kind of people giving their input here. I think it's not just in terms of kind of the time, in terms of like how a lot of non-disabled people think about it, but often like time and energy is like a really limited resource for a lot of disabled people. So for example, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, like I've worked with disabled people on projects who like, they're like, well, they'll turn up for like a half an hour meeting and that, but to do that, they've had to spend the last 2 days lying on the sofa resting to come along and give that. So it can be a really valuable resource sometimes. Obviously, that's not the case necessarily for everyone, but for a lot of people, that resource is kind of they're giving a very generous offering there, more so than you might know. I think even if you don't necessarily have those resources, those kind of resource problems, you might be like competing with a lot of other pressing crises. So disabled people have experiencing like extreme austerity for over a decade now, and just kind of experience a lot of problems with like poverty and kind of getting care provision. There's just huge amounts of unemployment within the community. So there are so many other crises to be kind of looking at. Sometimes it can be quite hard to look at the one that's like very important and scary, but a little bit further away than the kind of wolf that's at the door. So I think it's really helpful to think about what benefits you can offer. Like I'm aware, again, you might not have a lot of money, but like thinking about what forms of compensation you can offer. Shopping vouchers are really great where you can have that kind of resource in terms of not, if you, I think money is always the best thing to offer, but like often people prefer like vouchers just in terms of not impacting on benefits if they kind of get kind of extra money into their bank account. but some, if you know disabled people in your communities, talk to them, and like they might accept other forms of compensation if just money up front is just not possible. I think it's just the importance of valuing people's time in whatever way that looks like, that feels good to them. Around that, it's really important to provide like accessibility, costs, and transport. So again, because society is so inaccessible, it can just be hard to get to venues often. Like if your local buses are not accessible, or if pavement's not accessible, then just getting to a venue can be really difficult. So thinking about how you can support that to happen, and then meeting whatever access needs they might have. So for example, if they are a BSL user, do they need an interpreter? Do they need their PA to be able to come along with them? um, and then in terms of once you've kind of got all that set up, thinking about how to frame the issue to kind of bring people along. I think, as I was saying earlier, because it's competing with so many other bigger issues, a lot of disabled people can struggle to find the time to come along to kind of just the pure climate change kind of framed discussion. But if you frame it in terms of other issues that they already are kind of fighting on, that can really help. So, for example, I find here in Bristol talking about accessible, sustainable transport is really popular, just because transport is such an issue, accessibility issue anyway. People can kind of make time for that. And obviously, in terms of if we make our buses more accessible, then that stops people using cars so often, and then that is the sustainability issue. So I think they're one and the same issue a lot of the time. Obviously, make your meetings and venues accessible. So that there's kind of a whole, that could be a whole nother kind of conversation of itself. But I guess the top line things are like step-free access and accessible loo. Yeah, and kind of like having quiet spaces and that kind of thing are good as well. But there is a guide that I can share with some of that information straight after this, while we're waiting for the Grip Up Climate one to be ready. And just in general, I think it's really worth just going away and reading a bit about disability justice. I find that it's we're the minority marginalized movement that is the least cared about, unfortunately. I find that a lot of activists kind of can be quite keyed up on the issues related to other marginalized groups, but just don't tend to know much about disability. So go and read the history. Like there's a lot of really great work that's been done. But yeah, just to kind of give you kind of like a few quick pointers if you're just going to go away and like talk to a disabled person tomorrow within your community. Do be led by their language. So in the UK, we tend to use the term disabled person just to refer to the fact that people are disabled by society, rather than kind of disability being necessarily inherent within a person. So, for example, wheelchair user isn't blocked out of society because they're a wheelchair user. They're blocked because you put stairs in the building. But if you have a lift there, then they can access it the same as everyone else. But some people prefer to be called say that they're a person with disabilities. So the language just kind of varies. So I think it's in general it's safest to use disabled people. But if someone says to you, "Oh, call me a person with disabilities," then follow whatever they're most comfortable with. Do use accessible communication. So plain English, kind of having translation into BSL or easy read. Easy read is what people with learning difficulties need for written text. Alt text, which is where you put a kind of written description with an image as well. So a lot of, like, for example, social media or a lot of Word documents, there'll be like a function where you can type that in, and then that lets people with visual impairments access what's going on in the image as well. And just writing in plain English is just great for everyone. Like, I think in the climate change movement, we're very bad at like having a lot of very complicated and unnecessary jargon, which I think anybody outside the movement can like struggle to understand. I was creating an easy read version of our Just Transition Declaration today, and like my colleagues were saying, actually, I think this is the best one. This is the one that I think actually gets closest to what we were trying to say. So I think often by making our communications accessible, we're just making it better for everyone. Don't make assumptions, just ask, as I was saying earlier. You don't know what people can or can't do. I think it's just generally best to be led by when people want help, how they want that help, if they want help at all. But don't take that as an opportunity to ask personal medical questions. And then don't be offended if people say no to your offers of help, or sort of tell you how to do better. I think quite often there's this narrative of disabled people being people to be helped. And then I think that when people are told no, they kind of feel like, oh, does that mean like I'm not good enough or I'm not doing the thing, or like sort of seeing themselves as saviors who are rejected. But it's not that case. People just want to go about their lives in the way they want to go about their lives, or like want to help you do better by explaining kind of how you could do things. It's not an attack. Don't talk down to disabled people. Don't invade personal space. Wheelchairs and that kind of assistive technology can feel part of people's bodies. And just do talk to and laugh with disabled people about things other than their disabilities. Like I think I can't remember the exact statistic, but a scary percentage of the population don't talk to disabled people at all. I think like Scope found they thought it was because people are worried about saying the wrong thing, but the community can just be quite ostracized. And don't treat disabled people as if they're fragile. Let disabled people decide what they can do and how they can do it. And do speak directly to the disabled person. If they have a carer or an interpreter, don't talk to them and then ignore the disabled person.